I'm often asked about the camera settings that I use. Aperture priority, shutter priority, do I ever use manual settings, and what about the ISO? I don't know, I always kind of thought that this technical aspect of photography is pretty obvious, but over the years I've realized that this is not the case for everybody. So today I'm really diving in and I'll share what I believe are the best camera settings for travel photography. From my experience, these are the settings that allow me to quickly adapt and capture the moment, while still getting an image that looks good technically. You will be surprised with some things, so it's worth watching until the end. Now, I am in another beautiful area, not far from the capital of Brazil. This is a little forest with a river. The whole region is quite amazing. We've been exploring here a little bit with the family, and I thought I should make this video while things are quiet. Though, of course, as always in these places, there will be some bird sounds. So, if I could have the camera do everything for me and only have to press the shutter button and everything would look exactly as I want, I would absolutely love that. But that's impossible. I need creative control, so the next best thing to letting the camera do everything for me is aperture priority. It's that A on your dial. What's so good about aperture priority? It's kind of like full auto, like letting the camera do everything for you, but you can change the setting that has the most impact creatively on your images. And that's the F value that affects the depth of field. The higher the F value, the more depth of field. The more things are in focus. The lower the F value, the more shallow the depth of field. The more blurry the background in your frame, for example. And this is something that I don't want the camera deciding for me. I often shoot on what's referred to as wide open aperture, or the lowest possible F value. I do this because I like a nice blurred background or foreground, but sometimes I will raise the aperture value to get more detail in the background in focus. And hey, I'm really curious how many of you shoot on aperture priority and how many of you prefer shooting wide open. Drop me a comment. This is the setting that I'm absolutely fine not having control over, most of the time. If I want motion blur, like this, I'll set the shutter speed manually. And I will tell you when else I would do this in just a bit. But in general, I just want the shutter to freeze the moment. Whether it freezes the moment at 1/60th of a second or 1/4000th of a second, that really doesn't matter to me. Why? Because you, as the viewer, will not be able to tell the difference. It'll look the same. So in most cases, I allow the camera to do its thing and let it adjust the shutter speed for me. Now, I firmly believe that beyond any camera settings or any gear, the most important thing in photography is how you communicate visually. I've made an entire course to help you master visual communication. Even if you're already making good images, mastering visual communication will help you make photos that are amazing, that people will refer to as inspirational. There's a link to my course in the description of this video, and there's a discount code too. This is the dial I probably adjust most, so I want to have easy access to it. Usually it's just under my thumb, like this. If a camera doesn't have it, then I will program it to be easily accessed. With the exposure compensation dial, I intuitively adjust how dark or how bright my image will look. Generally, I underexpose more than overexpose, but depending on the situation, I could push the boundaries either way. So like here, I slightly overexposed this area to not completely lose the detail in this dark part, but I only exposed to a point where I still had enough details in there to bring them back out in post. I'll underexpose more in situations like these, where I want to preserve the highlights or the details in the sky or in a large bright area within the frame. So on a shoot, more than anything else, I'll be adjusting this dial back and forth, and I'll only be changing the other settings occasionally. This is where things get more nuanced. The ISO is not something that I adjust a lot, but I do want manual control over it. We know that very high ISO will produce grain, and while modern-day cameras are good at even higher ISOs, I still want as clean of an image as possible. I'd rather add grain later, if I want to. There is an option for auto ISO, and you can limit the ISO range so you never really get into that grainy area, but then it becomes a sort of a dance with the shutter speed, and you will need to set the minimal shutter speed also. I don't like doing this because I'm often moving from one environment into another, and sometimes the difference is really quite extreme, and so the settings really change as well. And so if I start getting into the auto ISO, then there are just too many settings to fiddle with, and rather than my life becoming easier and everything becoming more simple, the whole process just becomes a bit of a pain. So no auto ISO. Instead, I usually do this. I try to keep the ISO as low as possible, and I start raising it when I see the shutter speed going below about 1/25th of a second. Below this number, there's a possibility of camera shake blur or unwanted motion blur. With a larger and heavier lens, you can even get camera shake blur at 1/25th of a second or even a little bit higher, but generally with the stabilization features, you can avoid that. However, and this is why it's nuanced, if my subject isn't moving, or maybe if I don't mind a little motion blur, then I'm okay with having the shutter speed go down to much lower than 1/25th of a second. Sometimes I'd rather have a slower shutter speed and risk the blur in exchange for a guarantee of having less grain at a lower ISO value. Most people don't know this, but if you ever bought one of my educational resources, then you would have seen me share all of my settings for my photos. And sometimes they look something like this. The shutter speed is at an insane 1/10,000th of a second. That's electronic shutter speed, of course. And the ISO you can see as at 200, when I could have had it at 50 and reduced that crazy high shutter speed, at least a little bit. Or then there's something like this. From a logical standpoint, you'd think, why would you have the ISO at 800 here? You don't need the shutter at 1000. And I know that I could have lowered the ISO and still had a perfectly sharp photo at anything above 1/25th of a second here. To this, I say, and it may trigger some people, but I did not have time to fiddle with the settings to make them technically perfect. I needed to react to what was happening, or I'd lose the moment. And the same applies to these photos. I don't remember exactly how I made them, but I probably came from one environment that was very different to these conditions. But in all these cases, I knew that I was within the range of where the images would still look good, meaning not unnecessarily blurred or grainy. Depending on the camera, the ISO at 800 or even a bit higher doesn't look any different from ISO 100. Especially in well-lit situations, can go quite a bit higher in well-lit situations. And as I've already mentioned, the shutter speed doesn't make any difference visually as long as it freezes the action. So my priority is, before anything else, is to have the settings that will help me capture the moment while making a photo that looks good. Whether these settings are technically perfect or the best possible settings technically is really none of my concern. I really don't care, and I think that you shouldn't either. Well, if your aim is getting the image and you're not doing some sort of a school assignment. So for me, I do this in a few cases. Remember I said when I want to create motion blur. The effect can be achieved on aperture priority, but usually it's better to have more precise control. Like, for example, the camera might set the shutter at 1/25th of a second, and that works for motion blur. But let's say that I want just a little bit more blur. Full manual control over the shutter speed will allow me that. Maybe I need to set it to 1/15th of a second, or even to 1/8th of a second. So manual shutter speed just allows me to get exactly what I'm aiming for. Another case, sometimes if I'm shooting in little available light, like during the darker stages of twilight. In these cases, I might not want blur, and I don't want a really high ISO that'll cause grain. So I want to find that optimal setting and to be really specific in cases like these. Again, the settings that the camera chooses automatically may be just fine, but the less margin for error there is as far as degradation of how the image looks, the more I want predictable results and full manual control. Speaking of predictable results, there are situations which are particularly challenging for getting predictable results at auto settings. Artificial light, like light bulbs and street lamps, can throw the camera's exposure meter off, and you can end up with some inconsistent and unpredictable results. Shooting indoors with changing light might do this too. And most commonly, I find that this happens when shooting by the light of fire or candles. The light flickers, the camera exposure meter has to react very quickly, and you can get something very different from what you actually wanted. So I much prefer to set the camera to full manual in these situations. Honestly, this setting is something that I don't feel the need to bother with much. If you're shooting RAW, you can set it on whatever and just change it later. A good reason to shoot RAW. Having said this, I generally just have it sitting around 5500 Kelvin, and then depending on the situation, I tweak it in post. Of course, if you're shooting JPEG, then you want to set the white balance accordingly. This one is going to depend on the camera brand you have and even on the specific model, since different cameras have different autofocus systems. The setting that I usually use, ideally, is a combination of where I can touch on the area where my subject is, and then the camera locks onto the subject's eyes or the face, or if the subject is not human or animal, then it just locks onto the subject itself. So, the main thing that I would love for you to take away from this video is that the best settings are not the ones that will help you achieve a perfect image in the technical sense. The best settings are the ones that will help you capture a photo quick enough to not miss the moment, and still have it looking good technically without necessarily being textbook perfect as far as the numbers go. And of course, finding optimal camera settings is just the beginning. Far more important is your ability to communicate something through your photos. Mood, a sense of story, a sense of place. For this very reason, you should check out this video. It's all about mastering visual communication. And if you really want to take your visual communication to the next level, then there's my course in the description. That's it from me.